The sun blistered the Nevada desert as the Pacific Union engine No. 42 shrieked like a wounded beast, its metal frame groaning under unnatural pressure. Hannah Sinclair clutched the plush seat of the passenger car, her knuckles white, eyes wide with terror, as she felt the first violent lurch of the train leaving its tracks. The unmistakable sound of twisting metal and splintering would fill her ears as passengers around her screamed, their bodies tossed like rag dolls against seats and windows. Hannah had never imagined her journey to Sloan, Nevada would end like this. At 22, she had left her family's home in Boston with dreams of becoming a schoolteacher in the West, seeking adventure and independence far from the structured society she had known. Now, as the train careened off its tracks, those dreams seemed foolishly distant. The passenger car tilted precariously, suspended at an impossible angle. Through the chaos, Hannah glimpsed the harsh Nevada landscape through the window rock formations and sparse vegetation rushing toward her as the train continued its inevitable fall. Passengers who had moments ago been politely conversing were now scrambling over one another, desperate to escape the mangled car. Hannah tried to move, but found herself pinned between her seat and a displaced luggage rack that had fallen during the initial impact. "Help!" she cried, though her voice was lost among dozens of others calling out in terror and pain. The window beside her cracked in a spiderweb pattern as the car continued to shift. Beyond it, through the fractured glass, she saw a figure moving, a man on horseback racing alongside the derailing train. Miles Dawson had been riding the trail parallel to the railroad tracks when he heard the terrible screech of metal. The seasoned cowboy had seen his share of train accidents in his 30 years, broken axles, damaged tracks, but nothing like the catastrophe unfolding before him. The engine had jumped the tracks, dragging its passenger cars like broken limbs behind it. Without hesitation, he spurred his horse forward, racing alongside the disaster. Through the window of the second passenger car, Miles spotted a young woman trapped inside, her face a portrait of terror framed by auburn hair that had come loose from its pins. Their eyes met through the fractured glass, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them, a promise. The train car groaned as it tipped further toward its side. Miles guided his horse alongside it, calculating the diminishing time before the car would fully overturn. Balancing precariously in his stirrups, he stretched toward the window where the woman was trapped. "Take my hand," he shouted above the cacophony of bending metal and panicked screams. Hannah stared at the outstretched hand of the stranger, a cowboy with determination etched across his sun-weathered face. She stretched her arm toward the window, wincing as the jagged glass cut into her skin. Their fingers brushed, separated, then connected again with desperate strength. "The glass," she cried, feeling it cut deeper as she pushed against it. Without hesitation, Miles drew his revolver and used the butt to smash away the remaining glass from the window frame. "Now," he commanded, reaching both arms through the opening. Hannah pushed against her seat with her legs, straining to reach the window. The luggage pinning her shifted with the movement of the car, giving her just enough space to wriggle free. She felt the cowboy's strong hands grip her arms, pulling her toward the window as the entire car began its final descent into a ravine. With a strength born of desperation, Miles pulled Hannah through the window, fragments of glass tearing at her dress as she emerged. In one fluid motion, he pulled her onto his horse, wrapping a protective arm around her waist as he spurred the animal away from the disaster. Behind them, the passenger car crashed into the ravine with a thunderous boom, followed by the other cars in a terrible cascade of destruction. Hannah clung to the stranger, her face pressed against his leather vest, the smell of horses and dust, and something indefinably masculine filling her senses as they rode to safety. "Hold tight," Miles instructed, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. They galloped to a safe distance before he reined in his horse and turned to view the devastation. The train lay broken along the tracks, smoke billowing from the engine, screams still echoing across the desert. "There are others," Hannah said, her voice shaking but determined. "We have to help them." Miles nodded, impressed by her composure after such a narrow escape. "We will, but you're bleeding." He gestured to her arms, streaked with cuts from the glass. "It's nothing," she insisted, though the adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving pain in its wake. "Please, we must hurry." They rode back toward the wreckage, joining other travelers and nearby ranchers who had seen the smoke rising into the clear Nevada sky. For hours, they worked alongside strangers to free trapped passengers, tend to the injured, and recover the dead. Hannah used strips torn from her petticoat to bandage wounds, while Miles used his strength to lift debris and carry survivors to safety. By sunset, they had done all they could. The survivors huddled in small groups around hastily built fires, shock evident on their soot-stained faces. A relief train had been telegraphed from the nearest station and would arrive by morning. "You should rest," Miles told Hannah, guiding her to a quiet spot away from the main camp. "You've done more than enough." Hannah sank to the ground, suddenly aware of her exhaustion. Her traveling dress was torn and bloodied, her hands raw from hours of work. "I don't even know your name," she said, looking up at the cowboy who had saved her life. "Miles Dawson," he replied, removing his hat to reveal dark hair streaked with dust. "I ranch about 10 miles from here." "Hannah Sinclair," she said, offering her hand as formally as if they were being introduced at a Boston tea party instead of sitting beside a train wreck in the Nevada desert. "I owe you my life, Mr. Dawson." Miles shook her hand, noticing how small and delicate it seemed within his calloused grip. "Anyone would have done the same, Miss Sinclair." "No," she said with quiet certainty. "Not everyone would have ridden alongside a derailing train and pulled a stranger through a window." "You could have been killed," he shrugged, uncomfortable with her praise. "Where were you headed?" he asked, changing the subject. "Sloan, I'm to be the new schoolteacher there." Miles's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Sloan, that's where I was headed myself to pick up supplies." He gestured to the devastation around them. "Though I suspect those supplies won't be arriving anytime soon." Hannah managed a small smile despite everything. "It seems we were destined to meet, Mr. Dawson, though I would have preferred less dramatic circumstances." As night fell fully over the desert, survivors huddled closer to their fires. Miles found blankets among the scattered luggage and brought one to Hannah. "You should sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be another long day." Hannah accepted the blanket gratefully, suddenly aware of how cold the desert night had become. "What about you?" "I'll keep watch," he said simply, settling nearby with his rifle across his lap, his eyes scanning the darkness for any threat to the vulnerable survivors. In the morning, the relief train arrived from Carson City, bringing doctors, supplies, and officials to investigate the derailment. Miles and Hannah continued to help where they could, assisting the injured onto the rescue train. When it came time to board, Hannah hesitated. "My belongings," she said, gesturing helplessly toward the wreckage. "Everything I own was in my trunk." Miles understood her distress. Coming west was a significant undertaking, requiring careful planning and resources. To lose everything was devastating. "The railroad will compensate you," he said, though he knew that would be small comfort for the personal items that couldn't be replaced. "It's not just that," Hannah admitted. "I had letters of introduction to the town council in Sloan, proof of my qualifications to teach." Without them, I don't know if they'll still accept me. Miles considered this problem. I know most folks in Sloan, he said finally. I can vouch for you, help you get settled until the railroad sorts everything out. Relief washed over Hannah's face. You would do that for me. Seems the least I can do, he said with a modest shrug. Besides, Sloan needs a schoolteacher, something fierce. The children there have been running wild for too long. As they boarded the relief train, Hannah found herself studying Miles Dawson with new interest. He wasn't what she had expected of a Western cowboy. There was a gentleness beneath his rugged exterior, a consideration in how he spoke to her and to others that belied the harsh stereotype she had heard about in the East. The journey to Sloan took several hours, the relief train moving slowly to accommodate the injured passengers. Miles and Hannah sat together, sharing the sparse rations provided by the rescue team. He told her about Sloan, a small but growing cattle town with about 500 souls, a church, a general store, 2 saloons, and a school building that had stood empty since the last teacher had left 6 months prior. What made you decide to come west to teach? He asked as the train rattled through the desert landscape. Hannah watched the unfamiliar terrain passing outside the window. I wanted something different, she said after a moment. In Boston, my life was predetermined. My father is a banker, and he expected me to marry one of his colleagues' sons, to live the same life my mother has lived. She smoothed a wrinkle in her torn dress. I've always loved learning, and I wanted to share that love with children who might not otherwise have the opportunity. That's admirable, Miles said, genuine respect in his voice. It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind. What about you? Hannah asked. Have you always lived in Nevada? Miles shook his head. I came west from Missouri after the war. Fought for the Union, came home to find my family's farm in ruins. Decided to start fresh where the land was still open. A shadow passed over his face. Been ranching outside of Sloan for 7 years now. Hannah wanted to ask more about his past, about the war and what had brought the shadow to his eyes, but she sensed it wasn't the time. Instead, she asked about his ranch, and his expression lightened as he described the small herd of cattle he had built up, the horses he bred on the side, and the cabin he had constructed with his own hands. By the time they reached Sloan, Hannah felt she knew Miles Dawson better than she had known any man in Boston, despite the brevity of their acquaintance. There was something about shared danger, she supposed, that stripped away pretense and formality. Sloan was exactly as Miles had described it, a dusty main street lined with wooden buildings, horses hitched outside the general store, and curious faces turning to watch as the survivors from the train wreck disembarked at the small station. The railroad official had telegraphed ahead, so the town was prepared with food and temporary lodging for those affected. Miss Sinclair, a portly man with an impressive mustache, hurried toward them as they stepped onto the platform. I'm Harold Wilson, mayor of Sloan. We received word about the accident. Terrible business, just terrible. He pumped Hannah's hand vigorously. But thank the Lord you're safe. We've been eagerly awaiting our new schoolteacher. Hannah glanced at Miles in surprise. You know who I am, the mayor nodded enthusiastically. Of course. We received your letter of acceptance weeks ago. The whole town's been talking about it. He peered at her concernedly. But look at the state of you. Mrs. Peterson has prepared a room at the boarding house, and Dr. Miller will want to check those cuts. Thank you, Mayor Wilson, Hannah said, touched by the warm reception despite her bedraggled appearance. I'm afraid I've lost all my belongings in the accident, including my letters of reference. The mayor waved a hand dismissively. Don't you worry about that, Miss Sinclair. Your credentials were verified before we offered you the position. He turned to Miles with a nod of acknowledgement. "Dawson, good to see you pitching in as usual." "Mayor," Miles returned the greeting. "Miss Sinclair here was quite the hero herself after the wreck. Tended to a dozen injured folks before help arrived." Hannah felt her cheeks warm at the praise. "Mr. Dawson is being far too generous. He's the one who pulled me from the train just before it crashed into the ravine." The mayor's eyes widened. "Is that so? Well, I'll be. Seems we owe you a debt of gratitude, Dawson." He clasped Miles's shoulder. "You must join us for dinner at my home tonight. We're having a small gathering to welcome Miss Sinclair, and now it can serve to thank you as well." Miles shifted uncomfortably. "That's kind, Mayor, but I should get back to my ranch. Been away longer than expected already." "Nonsense," the mayor insisted. "Your ranch can spare you for one more night. Besides, I'm sure Miss Sinclair would appreciate a familiar face after her ordeal." Hannah found herself nodding in agreement. "Please, Mr. Dawson, I would be honored if you would join us." Miles looked from the mayor's insistent face to Hannah's hopeful one and relented with a slight nod. "All right, but I'll need to clean up first." Of course," Mayor Wilson agreed. "The dinner is at 7. That gives everyone plenty of time to rest and recuperate." He offered his arm to Hannah. "Now, Miss Sinclair, let me escort you to the boarding house where Mrs. Peterson is waiting." Hannah accepted his arm but glanced back at Miles. "I'll see you this evening, Mr. Dawson." Miles touched the brim of his hat. "Yes, madam, this evening." As Mayor Wilson led her away, chattering about the school and the town's expectations, Hannah found herself looking forward to the evening with surprising anticipation. Despite the trauma of the derailment, despite the loss of her possessions and the cuts that stung beneath her torn sleeves, she felt a flutter of something new and unexpected, a connection to the cowboy who had risked his life to save hers. The Peterson boarding house was a 2-story clapboard building at the end of Sloan's Main Street. Mrs. Peterson, a widow with steel gray hair and kind eyes, took one look at Hannah and clucked sympathetically. "You poor dear," she said, ushering Hannah inside. "Let's get you a hot bath and some fresh clothes. I'm sure I have something that will fit you until we can have new things made." The bath was heavenly, the first real comfort Hannah had experienced since before the derailment. Mrs. Peterson treated her cuts with a gentle touch and a homemade salve that smelled of herbs and honey. Afterward, she provided a simple blue dress that fit Hannah reasonably well, though it was a bit loose in the waist and short at the ankles. "You're a pretty little thing, Mrs. Peterson remarked as she helped Hannah pin up her hair. "The bachelors of Sloan will be falling over themselves once you're settled in." Hannah smiled politely, though the thought held little appeal. Boston had offered plenty of suitors, all chosen carefully by her father for their financial prospects rather than any compatibility with Hannah herself. She had come west partly to escape such arrangements. "I'm here to teach, Mrs. Peterson," she said firmly. "The children deserve my full attention." Mrs. Peterson smiled knowingly. "Of course, dear, but teaching and living aren't mutually exclusive, you'll see." She secured the last hairpin and stepped back to admire her work. "There, you look lovely despite everything. Now, you must rest before the mayor's dinner. Dr. Miller will be by shortly to check your injuries." Hannah did rest, falling into a deep sleep almost as soon as her head touched the pillow. She dreamed of the derailment, of glass shattering and metal twisting, but in her dreams, there was always Miles Dawson, reaching through the window to pull her to safety. She woke to a gentle knock on her door. "Doctor." Miller was a young man with spectacles and a serious demeanor who examined her cuts with professional detachment. "You're fortunate," he pronounced. "None of the wounds are deep enough to require stitches, and Mrs. Peterson's salve is excellent for preventing infection. Keep them clean and covered for a few days, and you should heal with minimal scarring. Thank you, Doctor, Hannah said, grateful for his care. There were others on the train far more seriously injured. Yes, I've been treating them at the clinic, he confirmed. But everyone is expected to recover, thanks in part to the quick action of people like you and Mr. Dawson. He packed his medical bag with practiced efficiency. The town is quite abuzz about how he rescued you, quite the romantic tale. Hannah felt herself blush. It was an act of heroism, nothing more. Dr. Miller smiled slightly. Of course, Miss Sinclair. Now you should prepare for the mayor's dinner. It's nearly 7. After he left, Hannah checked her appearance in the small mirror above the washstand. The borrowed dress was plain but clean. Her hair was neatly arranged, and though her face still showed signs of strain from the ordeal, she looked presentable. She touched a small cut on her cheek, remembering the moment Miles had pulled her through the window, the strength of his arms around her waist as they rode away from the derailing train. The mayor's house was the largest in Sloan, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and actual glass windows, a sign of prosperity in the frontier town. Hannah arrived precisely at 7, escorted by Mrs. Peterson, who was also invited to the dinner. Mayor Wilson greeted them effusively, introducing Hannah to his wife, a plump woman with an infectious laugh, and to the other guests, the town's banker and his wife, the owner of the general store, and the minister and his wife. Miles had not yet arrived. Dawson is always punctual for cattle drives but late for social gatherings, the mayor joked as he offered Hannah a seat in the parlor. Don't worry, he'll be here. Hannah tried not to show her disappointment, engaging in polite conversation with the other guests who were eager to hear about Boston and her journey west, at least until the derailment. She was relieved when Mrs. Wilson tactfully changed the subject to the upcoming school term. We have 27 children of school age in Sloan, Mrs. Wilson explained, from 6 years old to 16 and varying levels of education. Some can barely read while others are quite advanced. I'm prepared for the challenge, Hannah assured her. In Boston, I assisted at a charity school where we often had similar disparities among the students. The conversation continued, with the townspeople sharing their hopes for the school and their children's education. Hannah found them genuinely interested and supportive, unlike some communities where education was considered an unnecessary luxury. It was nearly 7:30 when the door knocker sounded, and the mayor's housekeeper ushered in Miles Dawson. Hannah almost didn't recognize him at first. Gone was the dust-covered cowboy in worn leather. In his place stood a clean-shaven man in a dark suit that, while not fashionable by Eastern standards, fit him well and emphasized his broad shoulders. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he carried his hat in his hands, looking slightly uncomfortable but undeniably handsome. "Dawson, finally," the mayor exclaimed. "We were beginning to think you'd changed your mind." "Sorry for the delay," Miles said, his deep voice carrying across the room. "Had to ride back to the ranch to change." His eyes found Hannah's across the parlor, and he nodded a greeting. "Miss Sinclair." "Mr. Dawson," she returned, surprising herself with how pleased she was to see him. "I'm glad you could join us." The dinner that followed was the most enjoyable social event Hannah had attended in years. Free from the rigid formality of Boston society, conversation flowed naturally, touching on everything from cattle prices to politics to literature. Hannah discovered that Miles, despite his frontier lifestyle, was well-read and articulate, contributing thoughtfully to discussions about recent events in the East that he knew only from newspapers. After dinner, when the men would normally have retired for brandy and cigars, Mayor Wilson instead suggested music. "Miss Sinclair, I understand from your letters that you play the piano. Would you honor us with a performance?" Hannah hesitated. "I would be happy to, Mayor Wilson, but I'm afraid my music was lost with my other belongings." "Oh, Ellen has plenty of sheet music," Mrs. Wilson assured her, leading Hannah to the piano in the corner of the parlor. "Or you could play from memory, whatever you're comfortable with." Finding herself seated at the instrument, Hannah took a moment to gather her thoughts, then began to play a simple melody she had learned as a child. The piano was slightly out of tune, but the familiar movement of her fingers across the keys was soothing after the chaos of the past 2 days. When she finished, the small gathering applauded warmly. "That was lovely, Miss Sinclair," Miles said, and something in his voice made her glance up to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Thank you, Mr. Dawson. You play an instrument?" He shook his head with a small smile. "No, madam, but I appreciate music all the same." The evening concluded with coffee and dessert, and as the guests began to take their leave, Miles approached Hannah. "May I walk you back to the boarding house, Miss Sinclair? It's fully dark now." Hannah was touched by the offer. "Thank you, that would be most kind." They walked in companionable silence for a few moments. The sounds of the small town at night, distant piano music from the saloon, the occasional whinny of a horse, muted conversations from open windows creating a backdrop to their stroll. "How are you feeling?" Miles asked finally. "After everything that happened yesterday." Hannah considered the question honestly. "Still shaken," she admitted. "I keep hearing the sound of the train coming off the tracks when I close my eyes, but also grateful to be alive, to be here." She glanced sideways at him. "To have met you." Miles cleared his throat, seemingly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "I'm just glad I was riding that trail when I was." "Was it fate, do you think?" Hannah asked, surprising herself with the question. "That you were there at that exact moment?" Miles was quiet for so long that Hannah thought he might not answer. Finally, he said, "I don't know much about fate, Miss Sinclair, but I do know that life can change in an instant. Yesterday proved that." They had reached the boarding house, its windows glowing with welcoming lamplight. Hannah paused at the bottom of the steps, turning to face Miles. "Will I see you again, Mr. Dawson?" she asked, aware of the impropriety of the question but unable to stop herself. Miles shifted his weight, hat in his hands. "I expect so, Miss Sinclair. Sloane's a small town." A slight smile touched his lips. "And I have nephews who will be attending your school." "Oh," Hannah said, both pleased at the connection and oddly disappointed that it was his only reason for seeing her again. "Well, I look forward to meeting them." "Miss Sinclair Hannah," Miles said, using her given name for the first time. "I'd like to call on you properly if that would be acceptable. Perhaps Sunday after church." A warm flutter of anticipation rose in Hannah's chest. "That would be very acceptable, Mr. Dawson." "Miles," he corrected gently. "If we're to be friends, you might as well use my name." "Miles," Hannah repeated, liking the sound of it on her lips. "Sunday after church, then." He nodded, replaced his hat, and gave a slight bow before turning to leave. Hannah watched him walk away, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness of Sloane's Main Street. Only when she could no longer see him did she turn and enter the boarding house, a small smile playing on her lips despite the lingering pain of her injuries. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity as Hannah prepared for the start of the school term. Mayor Wilson gave her a tour of the schoolhouse, a simple one-room building with rows of desks, a teacher's desk on a raised platform, and a pot-bellied stove in one corner. The blackboard was cracked in one corner and the books were worn and outdated, but Hannah saw potential in the space. It needs a woman's touch, Mayor Wilson admitted. And some repairs. I'll have the men see to the roof and the broken window before classes begin. The town's women, led by Mrs. Wilson and Mrs. Peterson, organized a teacher's shower, a gathering where each family contributed something to help replace Hannah's lost belongings. She received dresses, undergarments, toiletries, books, and even a beautiful quilt made by the town's quilting circle. Hannah was overwhelmed by the generosity. "You're all too kind," she said, tears threatening as she accepted each gift. "I don't know how to thank you." "Just teach our children well," Mrs. Wilson said, patting her hand. "That's all the thanks we need." On Sunday, Hannah attended the small church with Mrs. Peterson. The service was simpler than what she was accustomed to in Boston, but the congregation was welcoming, and she found the minister's straightforward sermon refreshing after years of complicated theological discussions that seemed far removed from daily life. Miles sat several pews ahead with an older couple and two boys who must be his nephews. He had nodded to Hannah when she entered but made no other acknowledgement during the service. It was only afterward, as the congregation spilled into the churchyard, that he approached her. "Good morning, Miss Sinclair," he said formally, conscious of the curious gazes of the townspeople. "May I introduce my brother Matthew, his wife Sarah, and their sons James and Thomas?" Hannah greeted them warmly, particularly the boys who would be her students. James, the elder at 12, was reserved and polite, while 10-year-old Thomas regarded her with open curiosity. "Uncle Miles says you were in a train wreck and he saved you," Thomas blurted out, earning a reproving look from his mother. "Thomas, that's not an appropriate topic for Sunday conversation." Hannah smiled at the boy. "It's all right, Mrs. Dawson. Yes, Thomas, there was an accident and your uncle was very brave." "Did you see anyone die?" Thomas asked, eyes wide. "Thomas," his mother exclaimed, mortified. "It's a fair question," Miles said quietly. "Children wonder about these things." Hannah knelt to be at eye level with the boy, her voice gentle but serious. "Yes, Thomas, some people did die in the accident. It was very sad and their families are grieving now. That's why we should be grateful for every day we have with those we care about." Thomas nodded solemnly, digesting this information. His father placed a hand on his shoulder. "We should be getting home," Matthew Dawson said. "The roast will be overdone. Miles, you're welcome to join us." Miles shook his head. "Thank you, but I've made other plans." He glanced at Hannah. "If Miss Sinclair is still agreeable, I thought we might take a walk." "That sounds lovely," Hannah said, ignoring the knowing looks exchanged between Matthew and Sarah Dawson. They walked beyond the town limits, following a well-worn path that led to a small creek. The day was warm but not uncomfortably so, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of sage and wild grasses. Miles had removed his suit jacket after church, and Hannah found herself admiring the breadth of his shoulders beneath his white shirt, the way the fabric pulled taut across his back as he moved. "Your nephews seem like fine boys," she said, breaking the comfortable silence that had fallen between them. "They are," Miles agreed, though Thomas tests his mother's patience regularly with his questions. "Curiosity is a gift in a student," Hannah said. "It's easier to teach a curious child than an indifferent one." "Is that why you became a teacher? Because you were curious?" Hannah considered the question. "Partly. I've always loved learning, discovering new things about the world. But I also believe that education is the key to a better life, especially for those who weren't born into privilege." Miles nodded thoughtfully. "My father believed that. He made sure Matthew and I could read and cipher, even when it meant sacrificing hours he could have spent working the farm." "And your mother?" Hannah asked, realizing she knew very little about his family beyond his brother's existence, A shadow crossed Miles's face. She died when I was 10. Fever took her in less than a week. I'm sorry, Hannah said softly. My own mother is alive but distant. She retreated into illness after my younger sister died as an infant. I was 7 at the time. Miles glanced at her, understanding in his eyes. So we both know what it is to lose someone young. They had reached the creek, where a fallen log provided a natural place to sit. Hannah arranged her skirts carefully as she settled onto the smooth wood, Miles joining her at a respectful distance. Tell me about your ranch, Hannah prompted, wanting to know more about his life. Miles spoke of his land with obvious pride, the 100 acres he had purchased with his savings after the war, the small herd of cattle he had built up year by year, the 3 horses he was training for sale. He described the cabin he had built himself, the vegetable garden he maintained, and the plans he had for expansion. It sounds wonderful, Hannah said when he finished. But lonely, perhaps, Miles shrugged. I have my brother's family nearby and neighbors I can count on when needed. But yes, sometimes the silence gets loud if you understand my meaning. I do, Hannah said, thinking of the nights she had lain awake in her father's house in Boston, surrounded by luxury but feeling utterly alone. Though I've found that being surrounded by people can be lonely too if they're not the right people. Miles studied her face. Is that why you came west, to find the right people? Hannah laughed softly. I hadn't thought of it that way, but perhaps you're right. I wanted a place where I could be valued for my mind and abilities, not just as someone's daughter or potential wife. And have you found that here? Miles asked. Hannah met his gaze. I believe I have. The people of Sloan have been remarkably welcoming, and they seem genuinely interested in education for their children. She paused. And then there's you. Me? Miles questioned, seeming genuinely puzzled. Yes, you, Hannah confirmed. You saved my life without knowing anything about me, not my family's wealth or position, not my education or accomplishments, just because I was a person in need. Miles looked uncomfortable with her praise. Anyone would have done the same. No, Hannah said firmly. Not anyone would have ridden alongside a derailing train and pulled a stranger through a window at risk to their own life. That takes a special kind of courage and compassion. Miles was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flowing creek. Finally, he said, the war taught me the value of a single life. I saw too many men die for causes they barely understood. After that, you don't hesitate when you see someone in danger. Hannah heard what he didn't say, the horror he must have witnessed, the losses he had endured. She reached out impulsively and placed her hand on his arm. Thank you for telling me that, and for saving me. Miles looked down at her hand on his arm, then covered it with his own. His palm was calloused from years of ranch work, but his touch was gentle. I'm glad I was there, Hannah. The way he said her name, with such quiet sincerity, made something shift inside her chest. For a moment, they sat together by the creek, connected by touch and shared confidences, the distance between Boston and Nevada, between their different worlds, seeming to diminish. The moment was broken by the distant church bell signaling the hour. Hannah reluctantly withdrew her hand. I should get back. Mrs. Peterson will be wondering where I am, and I have final preparations for school tomorrow. Miles stood, offering his hand to help her up. Of course. May I walk you back? They returned to town in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. At the boarding house steps, Miles removed his hat. Good luck tomorrow with the children. If Thomas gives you any trouble, just mention that his uncle will hear about it. Hannah smiled. I'm sure that won't be necessary, but thank you for the offer. She hesitated, then asked, Will I see you again soon? Count on it, Miles said, his eyes holding hers for a moment longer than was strictly proper. Good day, Miss Sinclair. Good day, Mr. Dawson, she replied, watching as he walked away, hat in hand. The first day of school was both exhausting and exhilarating. The 27 students ranged in age and ability just as Mrs. Wilson had described, from shy 6-year-olds to gangly teenagers who slouched in the back row. Hannah spent the morning assessing their knowledge, grouping them according to ability rather than age, and establishing expectations for behavior. James and Thomas Dawson sat in the middle rows, James serious and attentive, Thomas fidgeting but eager to answer questions. By the end of the day, Hannah had a clear plan for how to proceed with each group, though she knew it would require all her energy and creativity to keep them engaged while addressing their varied needs. As the weeks passed, Hannah settled into life in Sloan. The school thrived under her guidance, with even the most reluctant students showing improvement. She started a weekly reading circle for adults in the evenings, which quickly became popular, particularly among the town's women who had few social outlets beyond church. Miles called on her regularly, usually on Sundays after church, sometimes for walks along the creek, other times for community gatherings or simple visits on the boarding house porch under Mrs. Peterson's watchful but discreet eye. Hannah found herself looking forward to these visits with increasing anticipation, counting the days between them. During one such visit in late October, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset paint the distant mountains in shades of gold and purple, Miles seemed unusually thoughtful. "Something on your mind?" Hannah asked, noting the way his brow furrowed as he gazed toward the horizon. Miles turned to her, his expression serious. "Hannah, I've been thinking about the future." Her heart quickened at his tone. "Oh, yes, winter's coming, and with it the isolation that the season brings out here. My cabin's 10 miles from town, and there are times when the snow makes the road impassable for weeks." Hannah nodded, uncertain where this was leading. "I understand. Will you stay in town when the weather turns?" Miles shook his head. "No, I need to be with my cattle, make sure they have feed and shelter during the storms." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "What I'm trying to say is that I'll miss our visits, more than I should, perhaps." Hannah felt a flush of pleasure at his admission. "I'll miss them too," she said softly. "Hannah," Miles said, his voice dropping lower, "I know we haven't known each other long, but I feel a connection with you that I've never experienced with anyone else. Since that day on the train, something changed for me." Hannah's pulse quickened. "Miles, please, let me finish while I have the courage," he interrupted gently. "I'm not a wealthy man, and my life on the ranch is hard work from sunup to sundown, but I can offer you a home, protection, and my complete devotion. If you think, in time, you could consider a life with me, I'd be honored to continue calling on you with the intention of marriage." Hannah was stunned, though not entirely surprised. She had sensed the growing attachment between them, had felt her own feelings deepening with each visit, each conversation that revealed more of the thoughtful, honorable man behind the rugged exterior. "Miles," she began carefully, "I'm deeply touched by your offer, but I want to be certain. My decision to come west was partly to escape the marriage expectations in Boston, to find independence and purpose in my teaching." Miles nodded, his expression serious. "I understand that, and it's part of why I admire you so much. I would never want to take away your teaching or your independence. The ranch needs a strong partner as much as I do." He reached for her hand, holding it gently between both of his. "I'm not asking for an immediate answer. Only the chance to show you that a life together could enhance, not diminish, the purpose you found here." Hannah looked into his earnest face, feeling a warmth spread through her at his words. "I think," she said slowly, "that I would like that very much." Relief and joy transformed Miles's features. "You would?" "Yes," Hannah confirmed, smiling now. "I've come to care for you deeply, Miles. I don't need time to know that my feelings are genuine. But I would like us to continue as we have been for a while longer, to be certain we're compatible in all the ways that matter for a lifetime together." Miles raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. "That's more than I dared hope for, Hannah. Thank you." From that evening on, their relationship took on a new dimension of openness and shared future planning. Miles began bringing Hannah to his ranch on Saturdays, teaching her about cattle ranching, showing her the improvements he was making to the cabin with their potential life together in mind. Hannah found these visits educational and endearing, especially seeing how Miles had already set aside a room for books and learning, envisioning a space where she could continue to teach during the months when snow might make travel to town impossible. As winter approached, their courtship deepened. They attended Sloane's Harvest Festival together, danced at the Thanksgiving social, and exchanged small, meaningful Christmas gifts, Hannah giving Miles a hand-knitted scarf she had worked on during long evenings. Miles presenting Hannah with a carved wooden box he had made himself, perfect for storing her teaching supplies. By New Year, the entire town of Sloane assumed they would announce their engagement any day. Mrs. Peterson teased Hannah gently about wedding preparations, while Mayor Wilson dropped hints about the town needing a permanent teacher who wouldn't leave for marriage as the last three had done. "But I wouldn't be leaving," Hannah explained during a school board meeting in January. "Miles and I have discussed it thoroughly. I would continue teaching, even after marriage. During the worst winter weather, I might stay in town during the week, or children from the outlying farms might board in town as some already do." The board members exchanged surprised glances, unaccustomed to such a modern arrangement, but Mayor Wilson nodded approvingly. "That sounds sensible to me. Dawson's ranch is a fair distance, and we can't afford to lose you as a teacher. The children have made remarkable progress." The first major snowstorm of winter arrived in late January, blanketing Sloane and the surrounding countryside in 3 feet of snow overnight. School was canceled for several days, and Hannah worried about Miles, alone at his ranch. On the third day, just as the sun broke through the clouds, she heard the unmistakable sound of horse hooves crunching through snow outside the boarding house. She rushed to the window to see Miles dismounting from his horse, looking cold but unharmed. Hannah grabbed her shawl and hurried downstairs, meeting him at the door. "Miles, are you all right? I've been so worried." He stamped snow from his boots before entering, his face ruddy from the cold but his eyes warm as they found hers. "I'm fine, Hannah. Just had to make sure the cattle had enough feed to last the next storm that's coming." He removed his gloves, taking her hands in his. "But I couldn't stay away any longer. I needed to see you to make sure you were safe too." Mrs. Peterson appeared in the hallway, her expression a mixture of surprise and approval. "Mr. Dawson, what a pleasant surprise. Come into the parlor where it's warm. I'll bring coffee." They sat together in the boarding house parlor, Hannah listening as Miles described the conditions at the ranch and his preparations for the rest of winter. There was a new confidence in the way he spoke of the future, always including Hannah in his plans without presumption, but with hopeful certainty. When Mrs. Peterson tactfully left them alone for a few moments, Miles took Hannah's hands again. "I've been thinking," he said, "about us, about the future. The storm made me realize how precious time is, how quickly life can change." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet pouch. "This was my mother's. My father gave it to me before he died, said I should save it for when I found the right woman." From the pouch, he produced a simple gold band with a small, perfect diamond. Hannah Sinclair, I love you. Will you marry me? Hannah felt tears spring to her eyes. Despite their understanding, despite the weeks of courtship and planning, the actual moment moved her deeply. Yes, Miles. I love you too, and nothing would make me happier than to be your wife. He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit as if made for her. When he leaned forward to kiss her, their first kiss despite the months of courtship, Hannah felt the same rush of safety and rightness she had experienced when he pulled her through the train window all those months ago. Mrs. Peterson returned to find them seated slightly apart, though their clasped hands and Hannah's glowing face told the story clearly enough. Well, she said, beaming, it appears congratulations are in order. News of their engagement spread through Sloane faster than the winter wind, and by evening, the boarding house had received a steady stream of well-wishers despite the snow. Mayor and Mrs. Wilson insisted on hosting an engagement dinner as soon as the roads were passable, while Matthew and Sarah Dawson rode into town the following day to express their delight in person. We had hoped for this, Sarah told Hannah, embracing her warmly. Miles has been alone too long, and we've never seen him as happy as he's been these past months. The wedding was set for early June, after the school term ended and before the summer heat became too oppressive. The months of planning passed in a blur of teaching, preparations, and precious moments with Miles. Hannah wrote to her father in Boston, informing him of her engagement and inviting him to the wedding, though she held little hope that he would approve or attend. To her surprise, a letter arrived in April, not from her father but from her mother. It was the first communication she had received from her since leaving Boston. My dear Hannah, the letter began, your father shared your news with me, though I suspect reluctantly. He remains disappointed in your decision to leave Boston, but I find myself proud of your courage. The man you describe sounds worthy of you, honest, hardworking, and kind. These are qualities more valuable than wealth or position, as I have learned too late in my own life. The letter continued with wistful reflections and ended with a promise. While your father refuses to attend the wedding, I have decided to make the journey. It is time I saw more of the world beyond my sick room, and I long to meet the man who has won my daughter's heart. Expect me in late May. With love, your mother. Hannah wept upon reading the letter, overwhelmed by the unexpected support and the prospect of reconciliation with her mother after years of emotional distance. When she shared the news with Miles, he held her close, understanding the significance of this development. I look forward to meeting her, he said simply. Any woman who raised you must be remarkable in her own right. Margaret Sinclair arrived in Sloane 2 weeks before the wedding, a pale, elegant woman whose fragile appearance belied the determination it had taken to travel across the country alone. Hannah met her at the train station, anxiously watching as passengers disembarked, half expecting her mother to have changed her mind. But there she was, descending carefully from the train, her Boston finery looking out of place in the dusty Nevada town. Hannah, she said, opening her arms. My brave, beautiful girl. Their embrace was awkward at first, then fiercely emotional as years of distance melted away. Mother, I can't believe you're really here, Hannah whispered. Neither can I, Margaret admitted with a small smile, but I'm glad I came. Miles had insisted on being present for this important reunion, waiting respectfully a few paces behind Hannah. When Hannah turned to introduce him, she saw her mother's eyes widen slightly at the sight of the tall, broad-shouldered rancher. Mother, this is Miles Dawson, my fiancé. Miles, my mother, Margaret Sinclair. Miles removed his hat and bowed slightly. Mrs. Sinclair, it's an honor to meet you. Welcome to Sloane. Margaret studied him for a moment, then offered her hand. Mr. Dawson, Hannah's letters speak highly of you. I understand I have you to thank for saving my daughter's life during that terrible train accident." "It was my privilege, madam," Miles replied with simple sincerity, "though I believe Hannah has saved mine in more ways than she knows." Margaret's expression softened at his words. "Then it seems my daughter has chosen well." The 2 weeks before the wedding allowed Margaret to see Hannah's life in Sloane the respect she had earned as a teacher, the warm acceptance of the community, and most importantly, the deep and genuine love between her daughter and Miles. While initially shocked by the modesty of the boarding house and the rugged conditions of Miles's ranch, Margaret came to appreciate the authenticity of life in Sloane compared to the often superficial society of Boston. The wedding took place in Sloane's small church, filled to overflowing with townspeople and ranchers from miles around. Hannah wore a simple white dress made by the town seamstress, with lace that her mother had brought from Boston. Miles, handsome in a new black suit, waited at the altar with his brother as best man, his face transformed with joy as Hannah walked down the aisle on Mayor Wilson's arm. Their vows were straightforward and heartfelt, promises to love, honor, and cherish through all of life's challenges. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and Miles leaned down to kiss his bride, the church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward lasted well into the night, with food contributed by every family in town, dancing to fiddle music in the town square, and countless toasts to the newlyweds' happiness. Margaret Sinclair, initially reserved, found herself drawn into conversations and even dancing, displaying a liveliness that Hannah had never seen in her mother before. As the festivities wound down, Miles and Hannah prepared to leave for their wedding night at the ranch. Margaret embraced her daughter one last time. "I'm proud of you, Hannah," she whispered. "You found your place in the world and a good man to share it with. Your sister would have been proud, too." Hannah blinked back tears, touched by the mention of the sister she had barely known. "Will you come visit us again?" "Yes," Margaret promised, "and perhaps for longer next time. Your father may never understand your choices, but I do, and I want to be part of your life here." Miles helped Hannah onto his wagon, which had been decorated with flowers and ribbons by the town's children. As they drove away amid cheers and well wishes, Hannah looked back at the town that had become her home, at her mother standing among her new friends, and then at the man beside her, the cowboy who had pulled her from a derailing train and into a new life she could never have imagined in Boston. "Happy?" Miles asked, his hand finding hers on the wagon seat. "Completely," Hannah answered, leaning against his shoulder as they drove toward their future together. "It's strange to think that if that train hadn't derailed, we might never have met." Miles considered this. "I believe we would have found each other somehow," he said finally. "Some things are meant to be, Hannah. You and me were one of those things." As the wagon carried them through the Nevada night toward the ranch that would be their home, Hannah thought about fate and chance, about how life could change in an instant, a train jumping its tracks, a cowboy riding a parallel trail, a moment of connection through a shattering window. What had begun in danger and desperation had transformed into something beautiful and enduring, a love story written across the wild landscape of Nevada, and in the hearts of two people who had found in each other exactly what they needed. The ranch flourished under their joint care, with Miles handling the cattle and Hannah establishing a small school for the children of nearby ranchers during the months when traveling to town was difficult. In the spring following their wedding, Hannah discovered she was expecting their first child, news that brought tears of joy to Miles's eyes as he gently placed his hand on her still flat stomach. "A family of our own," he whispered in wonder. "Thank you, Hannah, for everything." Their son, Joseph, was born on a crisp autumn day. With Sarah Dawson and Mrs. Peterson assisting the town doctor, Miles paced anxiously outside until the newborn's first cry brought him rushing in to find Hannah exhausted but radiant, holding their tiny son. "He has your eyes," she told Miles as he carefully took the swaddled infant in his arms, his expression a mixture of awe and terror. "And your determination," Miles replied, noting the strength of the tiny hand that gripped his finger. "He'll need it growing up out here." Life with a child brought new challenges and joys to their partnership. Hannah continued teaching, sometimes with Joseph sleeping in a basket beside her desk, while Miles expanded the ranch, hiring 2 hands to help with the increasing herd and adding rooms to the cabin as their family grew. A daughter, Rebecca, joined them 2 years after Joseph, followed by twins Michael and Emily 3 years later. Their home became known throughout the region for its warmth and hospitality, a place where travelers could find a good meal and conversation, where neighboring children came for lessons, and where community gatherings often took place. Margaret Sinclair visited every summer, staying for months at a time, developing a surprisingly strong constitution for frontier life and a deep bond with her grandchildren. On her 4th visit, she brought news that Hannah's father had died, leaving his considerable fortune to Hannah as his only child. "What will you do with it?" Miles asked that night after the children were asleep. "We could move to a bigger town, buy more land, build a proper house." Hannah considered these possibilities, then shook her head. "This is our home, Miles. The money can go toward the children's education, perhaps a proper school building for Sloan, improvements for the ranch. But I don't want to change our life." Miles pulled her close, his arms still strong despite the years of ranch work. "Have I told you lately how much I love you, Hannah Dawson?" "Yes," she said, smiling against his chest, "but I never tire of hearing it." As the years passed, Sloan grew from a small cattle town to a respectable community with a proper school building, funded largely by Hannah's inheritance, a bank, and even a small hospital. The railroad that had once derailed, bringing Hannah and Miles together, now ran reliably, connecting Sloan to the larger world beyond. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were grown and pursuing their own dreams, Joseph running the expanded ranch, Rebecca teaching in the Sloan School, the twins studying at universities back east, Hannah and Miles would sit on their porch, watching the sunset paint the Nevada sky in colors no Eastern artist could capture. "Do you ever regret it?" Miles asked once, the silver in his dark hair catching the last light of day. "Coming west, staying here after everything?" Hannah, her own auburn hair streaked with gray but her eyes as bright as ever, took his hand in hers. The same hands that had pulled her through a train window decades ago, that had built their home, raised their children, and held her through joy and sorrow. "Never," she said with absolute certainty. "Not for a single moment." And as they sat together, watching darkness settle over the land they had tamed together, Hannah thought of all the paths a life could take, how a single moment of courage, a hand extended in danger, had led to this lifetime of love. She thought of the young woman from Boston who had boarded a train seeking adventure and independence, never imagining she would find everything she truly needed in the arms of a cowboy, brave enough to reach through a broken window and pull her into a new world.